Started. Okay, yes. Let me move my microphone onto my shirt. Okay. I'm recording like 3 of these in one day, but that's okay. That's all good. So on page 388, Balancing the Compromise Scales, I am going to the end of the chapter. Okay. Balancing the Compromise Scales. Who got the better deal in the Compromise of 1850? The answer is clearly the North. California, as a free state, tipped the Senate balance permanently against the South. The territories of New Mexico and Utah were open to slavery on the basis of popular sovereignty. But the iron law of nature, the highest law of all, had loaded the dice in favor of free soil. Southerners urgently needed more slave territory to restore the sacred balance. If they could not carve new states out of the recent conquest from Mexico, where else might they get them? The Caribbean was one answer. Even the apparent gains of South rang hollow. Disgruntled Texas was to be paid $10 million toward discharging its indebtedness, but in the long run this was just a modest sum. The immense area in dispute had been torn from the side of slaveholding Texas and was almost certain to be free. The South had halted the drive toward abolition in the District of Columbia, at least temporarily, by permitting the outlawing of the slave trade in the federal district. But even this move was an entering wedge toward complete emancipation in the nation's capital. Most alarming of all, the drastic new Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, the Bloodhound Bill, stirred up a storm of opposition in the North. The fleeing slaves could not testify in their own behalf, and they were denied a jury trial. These harsh practices, some citizens feared, threatened to create dangerous precedents for white Americans. The federal commissioner who handled the case of a fugitive would receive $5 if the runaway were freed and $10 if not, an arrangement that strongly resembled a bribe. Freedom-loving Northerners who had aided the slave to escape were liable to heavy fines and jail sentences. They might even be ordered to join the slave catchers, and this possibility rubbed salt in the old sores. So abhorrent was this man-stealing law that it touched off an explosive chain reaction in the North. Many shocked moderates, hitherto passive, were driven into the swelling ranks of the anti-slavery rights. When the runaway slave from Virginia was captured in Boston in 1854, he had to be removed from the city under heavy federal guard through streets lined with sullen Yankees and shadowed by black-draped buildings festooned with flags flying upside down. One prominent Bostonian who witnessed this grim spectacle wrote that we went to bed one night old-fashioned, conservative, compromised Union Whigs and waked up stark mad abolitionists. The Underground Railroad stepped up its timetable, and infuriated northern mobs rescued slaves from their pursuers. Massachusetts, in a move toward nullification suggestive of South Carolina in 1832, made it a penal offense for any state official to enforce the new federal statute. Other states passed personal liberty laws, which denied local jails to federal officials and otherwise hampered enforcement. The abolitionists rent the heavens with their protests against the man-stealing statute. A meeting presided over William Lloyd Garrison in 1851 declared, "We execrate it, spit upon it, we trample it under our feet." Beyond question, the Fugitive Slave Law was an appalling blunder on the part of the South. No single irritant of the 1850s was more persistently galling to both sides, and none did more to awaken in the North a spirit of antagonism against the South. The Southerners, in turn, were embittered because the Northerners would not, in good faith, execute the law, the one real and immediate Southern gain from the Great Compromise. Slave catchers, with some success, redoubled their efforts. Should the shooting showdown have come in 1850? From the standpoint of the secessionists, yes. From the standpoint of the Unionists, no. Time was fighting for the North. With every passing decade, this huge section was forging further ahead in population and wealth, in crops, factories, foundries, ships, and railroads. Delay also added immensely to the moral strength of the Union, to its will to fight for the Union. In 1850, countless thousands of Northern moderates were unwilling to pin the South to the rest of the nation with bayonets, but the inflammatory events of the 1850s did much to bolster the Yankee will to resist secession, whatever the cost. This one feverish decade gave the North time to accumulate the material and moral strength that provided the margin of victory. Thus, the Compromise of 1850, from one point of view, won the Civil War for the Union. Defeat and doom for the Whigs. Meeting in Baltimore, the Democratic nominating convention of 1852 startled the nation. Hopelessly deadlocked, it finally stampeded to the second dark horse candidate in American history, an unrenowned lawyer politician, Franklin Pierce, from the hills of New Hampshire. The Whigs tried to jeer him back into obscurity with the cry, "Who is Frank Pierce?" Democrats replied, "The young hickory of the Granite Hills." Pierce was a weak and indecisive figure. Youngish, handsome, militarily erect, smiling and convivial, he had served without real distinction in the Mexican War. As a result of painful groin injury that caused him to fall off a horse, he was known as the fainting general, though scalawagers pointed to the fondness for alcohol. But he was He was enemyless because he had been inconspicuous, and as a pro-Southern Northerner, he was acceptable to the slavery wing of the Democratic Party. His platform revived the Democrats' commitment to territorial expansion as pursued by President Polk and emphatically endorsed the Compromise of 1850, fugitive slave law, and all. The Whigs, also convening in Baltimore, missed a splendid opportunity to capitalize on their record in statecraft. Able to boast of a praiseworthy achievement in the Compromise of 1850, they might logically have nominated President Fillmore or Senator Webster, both of whom were associated with it. But having won in the past only with military heroes, they turned to another old fuss and feathers, Winfield Scott, perhaps the ablest American general of his generation. Although he was a huge and impressive figure, his manner bordered on haughtiness. His personality not only repelled the masses, but eclipsed his genuinely statesmanlike achievements. The Whig platform praised the Compromise of 1850 as a lasting arrangement, though less enthusiastically than the Democrats. With slavery and sectionalism to some extent soft-pedaled, the campaign again degenerated into a dull and childish attack on personalities. Democrats ridiculed Scott's pomposity. Whigs charted that Pierce was the hero of a many well-fought battle. Democrats cried exultantly, "We poked him in 44, we'll pierce him in 52. Luckily for the Democrats, the Whig Party was hopelessly split. Anti-slavery Whigs of the North swallowed Scott as their nominee, but deplored his platform, which endorsed the hated fugitive slave law. The current phrase ran, "We accept the candidate, but spit on the platform." Southern Whigs, who doubted Scott's loyalty to the Compromise of 1850, and especially the fugitive slave law, accepted the platform, but spat on the candidate. More than 5,000 Georgia Whigs, finality men, voted in vain for Webster, although he had died nearly 2 weeks before the election. General Scott, victorious on the battlefield, met defeat at the ballot box. His friends remarked whimsically that he was not used to running. Actually, he was stabbed in the back by his fellow Whigs, notably in the South. In addition, Free Soil Party candidate John P. Hale, senator from New Hampshire, siphoned off Northern Whig votes that might have gone to Scott. Hale walked away with a respectable 5% of the popular vote. The blind Pierce won in a landslide, 254 electoral votes to 42, although the popular vote was closer, 1,601,117 to 1,385,453. The election of 1850 was fraught with frightening significance, though it may have seemed tame at the time. It marked the effective end of the disorganized Whig Party and, within a few years, its complete death. The Whigs' demise augured the eclipse of national parties and the worrisome rise of purely sectional political alignments. The Whigs were governed at times by the crassest opportunism, and they won only 2 presidential elections in their colorful career, both with war heroes. They finally choked to death trying to swallow the distasteful fugitive slave law, but their great contribution, and a noteworthy one indeed, was to help uphold the ideal of the Union through their electoral strength in the South and through the eloquence of leaders like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. Both of these statesmen, by unhappy coincidence, died during the 1852 campaign, but the good they had done lived after them and contributed powerfully to the eventual preservation of a united United States. Okay. Expansionist stirrings south of the border. The intoxicating victory of the Mexican War, coupled with the discovery of gold in California just 9 days before the war's end, reinvigorated the spirit of manifest destiny. The rush to the Sierra Nevada gold fields aroused particular concerns about the fate of Central America. Since the days of Balboa, this narrow neck of land had stimulated dreams of a continuous Atlantic to Pacific transportation route that would effectively sever the 2 American continents. Whoever controlled that route would hold imperial sway over all maritime nations, especially the United States. Increasing British encroachment into the area, including the British seizure of the port of San Juan del Norte on Nicaragua's Mosquito Coast, drove the governments of both the United States and New Granada, later Colombia, to conclude an important treaty in 1848. It guaranteed the American right of transit across the isthmus in return for Washington's pledge to maintain the perfect neutrality of the route so that the free transit of traffic might not be interrupted. The agreement later provided a fig leaf of legal cover for Theodore Roosevelt's assertion of American control of the Panama Canal Zone in 1903. It also led to the construction of the first transcontinental railroad. Completed in 1855 at a cost of 1,000 lives lost to pestilence and accident, it ran 48 miles from coast to coast through the green hell of the Panamanian jungle. A full-blown confrontation with Britain was avoided by the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty in 1850, which stipulated that neither America nor Britain would fortify or seek exclusive control over any future Isthmian waterway, later rescinded by the Hay-Ponce-Forte Treaty of 1901. Southern slavocrats cast especially covetous eyes southward in the 1850s. They lusted for new slave territory after the Compromise of 1850 seemingly closed most of the Mexican cession to the peculiar institution. In 1856, a Texan proposed a toast that was drunk with gusto. To the Southern Republic, bounded on the north by the Mason and Dixon line, on the south by the Isthmus of the Tehuantepec southern Mexico, including Cuba and all other lands on our southern shore. Nicaragua beckoned beguilingly. A brazen American adventurer, William Walker tried repeatedly to grab control of this Central American country. He had earlier tried and failed to seize Baja California from Mexico and turn it into a slave state. Backed by an armed force recruited largely in the South, he installed himself as a president in July 1856 and promptly legalized slavery. One Southern newspaper proclaimed to the planter aristocracy that Walker, the gray-eyed man of destiny, now offers Nicaragua to you and your slaves at a time when you have not a friend on the face of the earth. But a coalition of Central American nations formed an alliance to overthrow him. President Pierce withdrew diplomatic recognition, and the gray-eyed man's destiny was to crumble before a Honduran firing squad in 1860. Sugar-rich Cuba, lying just off the nation's southern doorstep, was also an enticing prospect for an annexation. This remnant of Spain's once mighty New World empire had already held a large population of enslaved blacks, and it might be carved into several states, restoring the political balance in the Senate. President Polk had considered offering Spain $100 million for Cuba, but the proud Spaniards replied that they would sooner see the island sunk into the sea than in the hands of the hated Yankees. Rebuffed as buyers, some Southern adventurers now undertook to shake the tree of manifest destiny. During 1850 to 1851, two filibustering, from the Spanish filibustero, meaning freebooter or pirate, expeditions, each numbering several hundred armed men, descended upon Cuba. Both feeble efforts were repelled, and one last one ended in tragedy when the leader and 50 followers, some of them from the best families of the South, were summarily shot or strangled. So outraged were the Southerners that an angry mob sacked Spain's consulate in New Orleans. My God, I can't read. Spanish officials in Cuba rashly forced a showdown in 1854 when they seized the American steamer Black Warrior on a technicality. Now was the time for President Pierce, dominated as he was by the South, to provoke a war with Spain and seize Cuba. The major powers of Europe, England, France, and Russia, were about to become bogged down in the Crimean War, and hence were unable to aid Spain. An incredible cloak and dagger episode followed. The Secretary of State instructed the American ministers in Spain, England, and France to prepare confidential recommendations for the acquisition of Cuba. Meeting initially at Ostend, Belgium, the three envoys drew up a top-secret dispatch, soon known as the Ostend Manifesto. This startling document urged that the administration offer $120 million for Cuba. If Spain refused, and if its continued ownership endangered American interests, the United States would be justified in wresting the island from the Spanish. The secret Ostend Manifesto quickly leaked out. Northern free soilers, already angered by the fugitive slave law and other gains for slavery, rose up in wrath against the manifesto of brigands. The shackled black hands of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom, whose plight had already stung the conscience of the North, now held the South back. The red-faced Pierce administration hurriedly dropped its reckless schemes for Cuba. The slavery issue thus checked territorial expansion in the 1850s. Excuse me. The allure of Asia, the acquisition of California and Oregon had made the United States a Pacific power, or would-be power. How could Americans now tap more deeply the supposedly rich markets of Asia? Rivalry with the British Lion once again played a role. Britain had recently humbled China in the Opium War, fought to secure the right of British traders to peddle opium in the Celestial Kingdom. At the war's conclusion in 1842, Britain gained free access to 5 so-called treaty ports, as well as outright control of the island of Hong Kong, where it remained for another century and a half. Prodded by Boston merchants fearful of seeing Britain horn on their lucrative trade with China, President Tyler thereupon dispatched Caleb Cushing, a dashing Massachusetts lawyer scholar, to secure comparable concessions for the United States. Cushing's 4 warships arrived at Macao in southern China in early 1844, bearing gifts that included a weather vane and a pair of 6-shooters. Impressed by Cushing's charm and largesse, and also eager for counterweight to the meddlesome British, silk-gowned Chinese diplomats signed the Treaty of Wanghe. She pronounced it a certain way in class, and I don't know how it was. The first formal diplomatic agreement between the United States and China on July 3, 1844. Cushing was interested in commerce, not colonies, and he secured some vital rights and privileges from the Chinese. Most favored nation status afforded the United States any and all trading terms according to other powers. Extraterritoriality provided for trying Americans accused of crimes in China before American officials, not in Chinese courts. Cushing was prompted to seek this particular immunity by the memory of a seaman on a U.S. vessel who had been strangled to death by Chinese authorities for what was apparently the accidental drowning of a Chinese woman. American trade with China flourished thanks to Cushing's treaty, though it never reached the proportions his backers had dreamed of. More immediately important was the opportunity it opened for American missionaries, thousands of whom soon flooded prayerfully through the treaty ports to convert the heathen Chinese. Fatefully, America had now aligned itself with Western powers that chronically menaced China's cultural integrity. China's cultural integrity. All of them would one day reap a bitter harvest of resentment. Success in China soon inspired a still more consequential mission to pry open the bamboo gates of Japan. After some disagreeable experience with the European world, Japan, at about the same time as Jamestown was settled, withdrew into an almost airtight cocoon of isolationism and remained there for more than 2 centuries. The long-ruling warrior dynasty known as the Tokugawa shogunate was so protective of Japan's insularity that it prohibited shipwrecked foreign sailors from leaving and refused to readmit Japanese sailors who had been washed up on foreign shores. Meanwhile, industrial and democratic revolutions were convulsing the Western world. While Japan remained placidly secluded, by 1853, Japan was ready to emerge from its self-imposed quarantine. In 1852, President Millard Fillmore dispatched to Japan a fleet of warships commanded by Commodore Matthew C. Perry, the brother of the hero of the Battle of Lake Erie in 1813. Perry prepared diligently for his mission, voraciously raiding about Japan, querying whalers about Pacific Ocean currents, and collecting specimens of American technology with which to impress the Japanese. His 4 awesome, smoke-belching black ships steamed into Edo, later Tokyo, Bay on July 8, 1853, inciting near panic among the shocked Japanese. After tense negotiations, during which Perry threatened to blast his way ashore if necessary, Perry stepped onto the beach, preceded by 2 conspicuously tall African-American flag-bearers. From elaborately carved, gold-trimmed boxes, Perry produced silk-bound letters requesting free trade and friendly relations. He handed them to wary Japanese delegation and then tactfully withdrew, promising to return the following year to receive the Japanese reply. True to his word, Perry returned in February 1854 with an even larger force of 7 men of war. Once again, he combined bluster and grace, plying the Japanese with gifts, including a miniature steam locomotive and 350 feet of track. With this display of pomp and bravado, he persuaded the Japanese to sign the landmark Treaty of Kanagawa on March 31, 1854. It provided for proper treatment of shipwrecked sailors, American coaling rights in Japan, and the establishment of consular relations. Perry had inserted only a commercial toe in the door, but he had cracked Japan's 2-century cell of isolation wide open. Within little more than a decade, the Meiji Restoration would end the era of the shogunate and propel the land of the rising sun headlong into the modern world, and an eventual epical military clash with the United States. Excuse me. Oh, I need to take another sip. Okay. I get so much spit in my mouth when I'm reading. Okay. Pacific Railroad promoters and the Gadsden Purchase. Acute transportation problems were another legacy of the Mexican War. The newly acquired prizes of California and Oregon might just well have been the islands of some 8,000 miles west of the nation's capital. The sea routes to and from the Isthmus of Panama, to say nothing of those around South America, were too long. Covered wagon travel past bleaching animal bones was possible, but slow and dangerous. A popular song recalled, They swam the wide rivers and crossed the tall peaks and camped on the prairie for weeks upon weeks. Starvation and cholera and hard work and slaughter, they reached California spite of hell and high water. Feasible land transportation was imperative, or the newly won possessions of the Pacific coast might break away. Camels were even proposed as the answer. Several score of these temperamental beasts, ships of the desert, were imported from the Near East, but mule-driving Americans did not adjust to them. A transcontinental railroad was clearly the only real solution to the problem. Railroad promoters, both north and south, had projected many a drawing board route to the Pacific coast, but the estimated cost in all these cases was so great that for many years there could obviously be only one line. Should its terminus be in the north or in the south? The favored section would reap rich rewards in wealth, population, and influence. The South, losing the economic race with the North, was eager to extend a railroad through adjacent southwestern territory all the way to California. Another chunk of Mexico now seemed desirable because the campaigns of the recent war had shown that the best railway route ran slightly south of the Mexican border. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, a Mississippian, arranged to have James Gadsden, a prominent South Carolina railroad man, appointed minister to Mexico. Finding Santa Anna in power for the 6th and last time, and as usual in need of money, Gadsden made gratifying headway. He negotiated a treaty in 1853, which ceded to the United States the Gadsden Purchase for $10 million. The transaction aroused much criticism among Northerners, who objected to pay a huge sum for cactus-strewn desert nearly the size of Gadsden, South Carolina. Undeterred, the Senate approved the pact, in the process short-sightedly eliminating a window in the Sea of Cortez. Excuse me. No doubt the Gadsden Purchase enabled the South to claim the coveted railroad with even greater insistence. A southern track would be easier to build because the mountains were less high and because the route, unlike the unorganized territory, because the route, unlike the proposed northern lines, would not pass through unorganized territory. Texas was already a state at this point, and New Mexico, with the Gadsden Purchase added, was a formally organized territory, with federal troops available to provide protection against marauding tribes of Indians. Any northern or central railroad line would have to be thrust through the unorganized territory of Nebraska, where the buffalo and Indians roamed. Northern Railroad boosters quickly replied that if organized territory were the test, then Nebraska should be organized. Such a move was not premature because thousands of land-hungry pioneers were already poised on the Nebraska border, but all schemes proposed in Congress for organizing the territory were greeted with apathy or hostility by many Southerners. Why should the South help create new free soil states and thus cut its own throat by facilitating a northern railroad? Okay, sorry. It's crunching ice. Okay, Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska scheme. Last 2 pages. At this point, in 1854, Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois delivered a counterstroke to offset the Gadsden thrust for southern expansion westward. A squat, bull-necked, and heavy-chested figure, the little giant radiated the energy and breezy optimism of the self-made man. An ardent booster for the West, he longed to break the north-south deadlock over the westward expansion and stretch a line of settlements across the continent. He had also invested heavily in Chicago real estate and in railway stock, and was eager to have the Windy City become the eastern terminus of the proposed Pacific Railroad. He would thus endear himself to the voters of Illinois, benefit his section, and enrich his own purse. A veritable steam engine in breeches, Douglas threw himself behind a legislative scheme that would enlist the support of a reluctant South. The proposed territory of Nebraska would be sliced into 2 territories, Kansas and Nebraska. Their status regarding slavery would be settled by popular sovereignty, a democratic concept to which Douglas and his western constituents were deeply attached. Kansas, which lay due west of slaveholding Missouri, would presumably choose to become a slave state, but Nebraska, lying west of free soil Iowa, would presumably become a free state. Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska scheme flatly contradicted the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had forbidden slavery in the proposed Nebraska territory north of the sacred 3630 line. The only way to open the region to a popular sovereignty was to repeal the ancient compact outright. This bold step Douglas was now prepared to take, even at the risk of shattering the uneasy truce patched together by the Compromise of 1850. Many Southerners who had not conceived of Kansas as slave soil rose to the bait. Here was a chance to gain one more slave state. The pliable President Pierce, under the thumb of Southern advisors, threw his full weight behind the Kansas-Nebraska bill. But the Missouri Compromise, then 34 years old, could not be brushed aside lightly. Whatever Congress passes it can repeal, but by this time the North had come to regard the sectional pact as almost as sacred as the Constitution itself. Free soil members of Congress struck back with a vengeance. They met their match in the violently gesticulating Douglas, who was the ablest rough-and-tumble debater of his generation. Employing twisted logic and oratorical fireworks, he rammed the bill through Congress with strong support from many Southerners. So heated were political passions that bloodshed was barely averted. Some members carried a concealed revolver or a bowie knife, or both. Douglas's motives in prodding anew the snarling dog of slavery have long puzzled historians. His personal interests have already been mentioned. In addition, his foes accused him of angling for presidency in 1856. Yet his admirers have argued plausibly in his defense that if he had not championed the ill-omened bill, someone else would have. Let me take a sip. The truth seems to be that Douglas acted somewhat impulsively and recklessly. His heart did not bleed over the issue of slavery, and he declared repeatedly that he did not care whether it was voted up or down in the territories. What he failed to perceive was that hundreds of thousands of his fellow citizens in the North did feel deeply on this moral issue. They regarded the repeal of the Missouri Compromise as an intolerable breach of faith, and they would henceforth resist to the last trench of all future Southern demands for slave territory. As Abraham Lincoln said, the North wanted to give to pioneers in the West a clean bed with no snakes in it. Genuine leaders, like skillful chess players, must foresee the possible effects of their moves. Douglas predicted a hell of a storm, but he grossly underestimated its proportions. His critics in the North, branding him a Judas and a traitor, greeted his name with frenzied boos, hisses, and 3 groans for Doug. But he still enjoyed a high degree of popularity among his following in the Democratic Party, especially in Illinois, a stronghold of popular sovereignty. Congress legislates a civil war. The Kansas-Nebraska Act The Kansas-Nebraska Act, a curtain riser to a terrible drama, was one of the most momentous measures ever to pass Congress. By one way of reckoning, it greased the slippery slope to civil war. Anti-slavery Northerners were angered by what they condemned as an act of bad faith by the Nebraskals and their Nebraskality. All future compromise with the South would be immeasurably more difficult, and without compromise there was bound to be conflict. Henceforth, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 previously enforced in the North only half-heartedly, was a dead letter. The Kansas-Nebraska Act wrecked two compromises, that of 1820, which it repealed specifically, and that of 1850, which Northern opinion repealed indirectly. Emerson wrote, "The fugitive slave law did much to unglue the eyes of men, and now the Nebraska bill leaves us staring." Northern abolitionists and Southern fire eaters alike saw less and less they could live with. The growing legion of anti-slaverites gained numerous recruits who resented the grasping move by the slaveocracy for Kansas. The Southerners, in turn, became inflamed when the Free Soilers tried to control Kansas, contrary to the presumed deal. The Proud Democrats, a party now over half a century old, were shattered by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They did elect a president in 1856, but he was the last one they were to boost into the White House for 28 long years. Undoubtedly, the most durable offspring of the Kansas-Nebraska blunder was the new Republican Party. It sprang up spontaneously in the Middle West, notably in Wisconsin and Michigan, as a mighty moral protest against the gains of slavery. Gathering together dissatisfied elements, it soon included disgruntled wings, among them Abraham Lincoln, Democrats, Free Soilers, Know-Nothings, and other foes of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The hodgepodge party spread eastward with the swiftness of a prairie fire, and with the zeal of a religious crusade. Unheard of and unheralded at the beginning of 1854, when the nativist Know-Nothings instead seemed to be the rising party of the North, it elected a Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives within 2 years. Never really a third-party movement, its wide wingspan gave it a flight overnight as the second major political party, and a purely sectional one at that. At long last the dreaded sectional rift had appeared. The new Republican Party would not be allowed south of the Mason-Dixon line. Countless Southerners subscribed wholeheartedly to the sentiment that it was an N-word stealing, stinking, putrid abolition party. The Union was in dire peril. My tongue hurts. This book literally has so much. What is that called? Alliteration. There's so much alliteration, and there is no need for it. Why? Okay. Anyways, I'm done.